I'm going to start this one off by listing the things I've observed this year, 2020, that have impacted my personal experience and could impact the experiences of others with regards to what we call cancel culture, the things I've noticed. Indeed, 2020 has been an interesting year overall. There's been lots of different issues and schisms and arguments, between COVID and then George Floyd and then other things, But then there's also this topic. Then there's this thing that I'm choosing to, end the year on. There's definitely been some kind of attitudinal shift, or a shift in perception, within culture of what's acceptable, within language, within speech, within content. I think everyone who's online has probably noticed it to some degree. Some probably more than others. Of course, attitudes regarding the shift might be different. And within personal experience, personal daily experience as well. We could get into examples. I'm going to get into examples right off the bat. So if you go to the Twitterverse, the kinds of things people talk about, there's been a non-insignificant influx of posting regarding certain things along the lines of identifications of language forms that may or may not be acceptable, or questioning the acceptability of existing conventional language forms. For example, the term "you guys." I'm seeing lots of things along, in this kind of, language policey category. Arguments about how the term "you guys" is sexist because it doesn't include it's a term for men only, but it can be used to apply to refer to groups that include men and women. I've seen arguments about, there's the whole Latinx thing that showed up when George Floyd died. There was a huge influx of all kinds of posting regarding racially insensitive language, blacklist and whitelist, and then master and slave, the whole master-slave dialectic within philosophy. I'm sure at some point Nietzsche as a whole will just be completely banned in that regard. There's also things that are just like weird. I mean, this is small stuff, by the way. The stuff I'm covering now, it's just the most obvious stuff. There's stuff that's just bizarre. There's like there's posts about the term Nazi. The term Nazi even used in irony when talking about like a feminazi or a grammar Nazi, or just using the word Nazi loosely to not refer to the the serious topic of what the Nazis actually were is incorrect. There's an argument I saw about that. I keep my ear, I keep my hand on the pulse of these kinds of conversations more, so I notice this shit. I'm sure many people don't, or they don't notice enough of it and don't care. But yeah, it's also like it's happening and on YouTube as well. I'm seeing comments like disappear. Comments that were previously thought to be inoffensive are now vanishing. Twitch has updated its rules to ban words like incel and cuck and simp. And hell, I could be personally attacked by those words, but I don't want those words to be banned, right? And I don't think most people did for that one. So those are the examples within language. There's Latinx. There's generally seems to be some kind of at least within the online spaces, an influx of ideas with regards to how to change language, how to update it, how to make language less phobic, less offensive, etc. That's not cancel culture, by the way. None of that stuff. That's just the shift that I mentioned. Okay. It ties in with cancel culture, naturally, because if you change the definition of what's offensive, the stuff that people are used to using will now be offensive, and then offensiveness gets punished, and that stuff gets punished. So the connection should be obvious to anyone watching this, but I laid it out there anyway. The statue thing. The shift is present in the statue conversation as well. The statue thing, hit me a lot because, as personally, once again, I don't care about statues, but impersonally, I do. it used to be the case that the argument about statues was arguments about like war criminals, like or horrible people in the past, like Columbus, should be banned or taken down. But then when the George Floyd protests were happening, the statue thing progressed into all kinds of other characters, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, some Union soldier guy. Like there's all kinds of cases. I remember when it was going down, there's just list after list of various statues. The Abraham Lincoln statue that has like a slave kneeling down, even though it's to celebrate the emancipation. Examples like that. It's funny because Donald Trump, I remember once tweeted like, they want to take down a statue of this guy, Columbus. What are they going to want next? George Washington? And then lo and behold, they decided to take down statues of George Washington, etc. People have been banned from platforms more. The biggest one that I noticed in this category was Stefan Molyneux. And I have, more or less the same gripes with his that I've always had. But I didn't think the guy should have been banned. Like his entire content list, now he lives on BitChute, and it was YouTube and then Twitter immediately afterwards. Private contracts have been violated. Peterson with his book deal, that's another like example. Like before it would be you're banned from platforms. Now with Peterson, he's trying to get his book published, and people interfere within the publishing company, like we don't want to get this book published because it's offensive or something. So those are the obvious things. Those are the examples I can come up with. Right off the top of my head, there's definitely more things. In my own personal life, I've noticed sensitivity towards certain things that were always offensive, but it is greatened. Like words like the word retard, for example, or retarded, which is words like, or even using the word like the word gay. That's gay pejoratively. The attitude from the same people towards that type of language has become more sensitive. The sense that this language is offensive was always there. It was always offensive. That's fine. But now the offensiveness has been kind of reinforced. It's not just offensive and like boorish. It's now bordering on morally unacceptable enough to tell you to shut you down and tell you to stop talking, basically. These kinds of differences I've observed in interactions with my personal life. And then there's, of course, the things you notice at work with the kinds... And George Floyd, when that thing happened, that was like when this stuff really kicked off. Because it was always a thing. I mean, people have been talking about this shit for years, but when George Floyd happened, that's when it like cranked up. It went to 11. The amount of stuff like the racial sensitivity training stuff started happening. It was mandatory, and the kinds of stuff they started to talk about, and it's now being reinforced over and over again. Like all these companies, they panicked and they just started, imposing this stuff basically on everyone. Imposing it may be a strong word, but they basically made it became more present. It had more presence than it did before. It was always there, but it had way more presence, way more noticeable. So those are the shifts. But what does that have to do with cancel culture? Well, let's start with the question as to what is cancel culture. Cancel culture, as I understand it, is... In a most general sense, cancel culture is when doing anything to stop someone else from doing what they would otherwise do. But that is in a most like general sense. Killing someone is canceling them. Putting someone in jail is canceling them. Forcing someone to stop doing something using force or violence is canceling them. But those aren't really the tactics of cancel culture. That's not really what describes cancel culture in the internet age that we live in. You could call that cancellation in a broader sense. Governments can cancel people. Companies can cancel people. But what's unique about cancel culture in our time that I seem to notice is that all of the cancellation is through means that are completely non-violent and non-forceful, perfectly peaceful means. And that kind of goes against, I suppose, some kind of conservative notion that, or libertarian notion that cancel culture is against liberty. It's not really against liberty. It's the process that can lead to cancellation can be totally fair in the sense that the actions of all the individual agents are fair. You know, the people who hear what they don't like are being fair, and the people who react to it are being fair from their, you know, self-interest and so on. Maybe fair is a strong word as well, but the point is it's certainly peaceful. Nothing about cancel culture that I've observed is overarchingly violent or coercive in a like an action sense, right? It's, you know, canceling, forcing people to stop, compelling people to stop doing whatever they would otherwise do through non-violent means, through means of basically social excision, right? You don't need to violently impose against someone if you could just convince everyone to not want to associate with them. You know, if a platform chooses, well, we're not going to associate with you, there's nothing violent about that. If a company chooses to fire you, there's nothing violent about that. You know, if a credit card company chooses to, you know, cancel your card, there's nothing violent. It's through civility. The process is completely civil, and that's actually what makes it more sinister, because you can't attack it as easily as you can attack open acts of violence. Although that has also kind of become confounded when you have revolutionaries and rioters and so on. But you certainly can't easily, you know, just attack the actions of platforms that are completely non-violent. But I think you should. Because as I've said before, just because you know, and I've always sort of believed this, but just because something is non-violent doesn't mean that the ends are justified, doesn't mean that the outcome is fair. Libertarians, right-wing libertarians, always believed in this idea that, like, if all the interactions are non-violent, then the outcome's always fair, but that's not true at all. You can imagine economic outcomes that are not fair, that don't operate through any sort of violence. You know, like, imagine for a second, you know, we're on an island and I find some food and you know, it's my property now, but I decide not to give it to anyone else. There's no violence there, but there is, you know, a harm that happens, right? It's like that. Next, when it comes to this debate about whether or not something is or isn't cancel culture, whether cancellation is or isn't justified, people who, at least the people who are progressive, that are on the side of what people like me would call cancel culture, will probably argue, well, several things. They might argue that there's a difference between criticizing someone and canceling them, at which point we have to... This goes back to my whole thing about peaceful means leading to non-peaceful outcomes, non-violent means leading to unjustified outcomes. It might feel like everyone's just criticizing, but the outcome is still somehow unfair, right? If it ended at criticism, but it doesn't end at criticism, does it? You criticize someone, you know, such that their entire channel gets shut down. That's not a criticism. Personally, I don't know how it could be. When I criticize someone like Stefan Molyneux, there's no implication that his entire channel should be shut down or that he should be chased out of the internet. My implication is that he should either voluntarily choose to stop making that content because he's wrong, and he should be shamed for making it if he's wrong, or that he should be convinced and change the content that he makes. Those are the objectives, the implicit objectives I have in mind. This is not one of them. So it just doesn't feel like an acceptable outcome to begin with. But there's an argument there to still be made because, of course, I might not control what the outcomes of my criticism are. If I'm criticizing someone like Stefan Molyneux, and so is everyone, you know, maybe someone decides along the way that there's, you know, something should be done and Molyneux should be canceled. You know, a further step should be taken. But at least it's important for individuals to understand that when you're criticizing someone, you should not be chasing those kinds of ends for them to simply be shut down. And I think the problem is people are. The problem is people are. And when you also introduce things like, spam reporting, when you introduce mechanics that allow people to report and complain and issue complaints to the platform or the institution or whoever, there is more at play than simply a criticism of someone, naturally. Statistically, I'm not into the internet space enough to know how much of that stuff is happening, but it is happening for sure. So if it's happening, you cannot say that what's happening is merely criticism. Okay? So there's that. I had another point that I just forgot. This is the other point. The other point that a progressive who is in favor of what I would call cancel culture would say, what they might also say is that we need to have social change. And this is actually not as bad of a point as it sounds. We need to be progressive, right? We need to somehow change society and improve it and so on. That's going to be their attitude. And it doesn't just not make sense. And I remember for the longest time in the early 2000s, like, there was all these people on the internet, on YouTube, Dave Rubin and Sargon of Akkad, and all these people talking about free speech. And I just never understood what the point of their argument was back then. I do now, but back then I didn't get it, because it was always like, what is the point of free speech if you can't ever change anything? Right? If you can't change the things you're trying to change, if you can't make progress, what is the point of free speech? It's like we can talk and talk, but nothing happens. It seemed totally trite and pointless to defend the mechanic of free speech itself, since by itself it's such an incomplete thing. It doesn't, it doesn't maintain or pursue any kind of positive end or any kind of non-negative end. So why is it something that's so? It just didn't seem that compelling. Like, I understood realistically, like, yes, free speech matters, obviously, but why is it so important when what really happens is you talk and you talk and you talk and you argue, but nothing happens? The argument now would have to be that the reason nothing happens is because you haven't convinced people. That's the difference. It's not because you can't. It's not because your progressive wishes are wrong, but because you can't. If you haven't convinced them, that's why nothing's happening. You have to convince them, then things will happen. So the point of free speech is to maintain that process is as peaceful as possible. That you don't just, having not convinced people, skip over that part of the process and then jump straight to the conclusion where you make your ideal realized in the world and force it in, basically, without people having been convinced. That's the point of it. So there's an argument against that as well. And then the next point here I can make is that not all change has to happen through cancellation, especially changes with language. Changes with language can be agreed upon. Changes with language there can be a fair and just dialogue where everyone understands everyone's perspective and everyone accounts for everyone's perspective and wishes, and then the decision is made. And I don't think that process is in place. And I mentioned this back in with the statue thing as well, in my police video, but with the statue thing, each and every statue has to be its own conversation about whether or not it should be taken down. There's no reason to suspect that the actions that lead to some of these changes have involved conversations that were justified, that a proper dialectic took place each and every time. There's no way to guarantee that, just like there's no way to guarantee from the voluntarist perspective, from the libertarian perspective, that all market outcomes are fair, just because, even if you have like fair trade and the non-aggression principle. So you cannot guarantee fair outcomes in that case. You cannot guarantee fair outcomes in this case. It's very interesting how both the left and the right here rely on such simplistic conventional maxims. Like, there's no way to guarantee that this was fair. And there's certainly no way to guarantee it when, as soon as a counter argument is presented, it's like shut down very instinctively, right? Perhaps this is because the form it's presented in, but regardless of that, you have some responsibility to be open about the form that it comes in. But in this case, the counter argument is just people trolling. Oh, and that's actually a great example of that is all of the movie critics that exist on YouTube and all the shit that's happened with regards to movie criticism over these past few years. You know, when it came to the new Star Wars movies or Captain Marvel or Cuties, there's loads of people online, both left and right, that say these movies are trash. These movies are trash. But the conventionalists that are, you know, the reviewers, the journalists, and the people who made those movies instinctively just say, oh, these people are just trolls. These people are just trolls without really, you know, acknowledging or examining their arguments even fairly, without considering that there may even be a reason, you know, to dislike the output. I guess there's a sense of confirmation bias where you don't want to admit that you made a movie that was bad, but nonetheless, this is what happens, right? When the correct argument is not on your side, right, you don't want to listen to the people who have it because of how it sounds, or you just don't want to be wrong, okay? You don't care if those people get canceled, right? You don't care. You instinctively call them something that they're not and just say, well, they don't have any point. There's nothing at stake with telling them to go fuck themselves. And the result is that unfair process I mentioned, the dialectic, you know, basically devolving into just in unjust, improper bastardization of a proper dialectic, no conversation, no discourse, and no one's convinced. Yeah, that's how it. And at this point, I guess people just have like built-in ideologies for dismissing certain, you know, sides of the dialectic to the point where there is no way to make ground, and that's a problem. Now, I will also point out right here that cancel culture is a personal issue for me. It's an issue that I'm willingly going to admit that ties into my self-interest directly. Like, relative to all these other political issues, I can talk about them, but those things are not, for me, they're interesting from an impersonal standpoint. Like with politics, there's things that you know, there's things that are good, and there's things that you care about, but then there's things that affect you. You know, this actually affects me. The other issues in politics don't affect me. I might still be in favor of them or against them. You know, various issues and opinions about on anything can be framed from both an impersonal and personal perspective. And I think we all care about certain things impersonally. I think most, you know, left-wing progressive concerns are impersonal. Okay. Whereas most right-wing concerns are actually personal. And this here is personal, for me at least, because I'm a politically incorrect person. It might not be obvious from now, but if you watch my Dark Souls streams or stuff like that, I'm a very politically incorrect person, and that's just sort of the way that I am. And I don't see reason enough to not be. At the very least, this is where it gets, there's a conversation here to explain. It's like, I'm not against being socially punished for that, but I am against being canceled for it. Okay? Because there's a difference between those things as well, right? There's a difference between social consequences and cancellation. These things are conflated by the people in favor of what I call cancel culture as well. That, you know, cancellation is merely a social consequence. Social consequences can take many forms. Some of them are fair, some of them are private, some of them are just, some of them are reasonable. But what we have now is many of them are not. And, yeah. So, I'm going to try to justify why. So let's talk about, so that's the whole context. One of the things I think that's true about cancel culture is that cancel culture is not new, and cancel culture is not special, in the sense that it's not exclusive to the value system of the people who propagate it. cancel culture has, like I said, in a broad sense, has always existed. Governments can cancel people. Media has the effect of canceling people by destroying their reputations. So on. Societies, like the masses, have the ability to cancel people. I mean, not any powerful institution, just the masses themselves, because a mob of people can just decide to not like you, and then you're screwed because no one will associate with you because they fear the wrath of the mob, or the consequences towards the mob. They don't want to associate with you. So that, and this is not something that's new to human civilization whatsoever. What is new is the way that it's manifested as a result of the internet. The internet has made cancel culture, I think, has made many different kinds of human behaviors cancelable that were previously not cancelable, because even if they happened, they would only happen in relatively private contexts, and there was no mechanism to get people as a whole, as a mass, to react to them. So, for example, offensive speech or racist speech. This used to not be as big of a deal from a perspective of cancellation, because if you did it, you would get letters of people hating you, and you would get some people not wanting to associate you, but this was not exposed to everyone. Okay, that you had these hateful qualities. Your hateful qualities would not be exposed to the entire world, and thus the entire world didn't have an implicit reason to have a negative perception of you, one. Or, what I actually think is even more important than the moral perception of you, but the fear that the moral perception would tarnish the reputation of anyone who associates with you. Because that's what's actually driving cancel culture as well. It's not people's attitude towards speech by itself. It's the fear that associating with someone who has a bad reputation hurts the reputation of whoever does it. And that's what perpetuates it, right? So that's the thing. The internet has reinforced it like crazy. It has made it ultra powerful, because now everything is exposed. Everything is exposed, and so while before speech is something that could still, if it mattered, could happen relatively privately, so it couldn't be exposed, and because it couldn't be exposed, the problems therein could be resolved, or would have to be resolved, privately. The mass media didn't have the ability to expose that type of stuff to everyone. So if someone had a problem with it, they would only have a problem with it in private. And they could try to write an article about you or something, but who the hell wants to read that? It didn't have the same effect unless you were someone who was very popular that everybody knew about, who did certain things. Okay, and this is in the 20th century. This is a basic intuition that I have that I think is fairly accurate. And when it comes to the internet, obviously even the average person is sort of at risk to an extent, because thanks to social media and thanks to mass media and everything being online, the entire the beating pulse of the economy happening through the internet forces everyone to be exposed to everyone else. And because you're exposed, all of the bad things that you do, all the offensive things that you do and say and might do, or the things that could be frowned upon, or the things that could be used against you, could easily be used against you, because everything is more exposed. And that's what's created this. Notice that whole description has nothing whatsoever to do with your political values. It has nothing to do with what's left or right. It is often levied that the left is responsible for cancel culture, or at least it seems that way, and I don't actually think that's true. I think that it just happens to be the case that it's left-wing values that are most present and most dominant in the areas where cancel culture is most likely to happen. That is online, in the media, in Hollywood, and within those circles. That culture form has taken over public life much more so than a different value system, a more conservative value system that that defines purity in other ways, in more religious ways. That has not dominated popular public culture, and that's why that stuff is not canceling people as much. But it easily could. It's just pure happenstance that it hasn't. If we had a conservative culture, conservative in the nominal sense, conservative in the sense that we had a culture that cared about, religious purity, or a culture that cared about racial purity, or a culture that cared about, some other kind of, sacred, patriotic, other kind of value, and the internet were invented at the same time and became popularized, that culture would become the cancel culture. Okay, it's not exclusive to the left. It just happens to be that the left is the one that's in power within culture in this way. It's weird to say that the left is in power. There's going to be people who disagree with that. I'll explain what that means later in the video, though. So, yeah, this is not something you can blame the left for, and I have no doubt that the right would be doing the same thing if many of them, if they were in power. And the reason is because cancellation is to some. Actually, before I get into that, there's even actually already examples of this. There's examples of right-wing censorship happening. I'm sure there's left-wing people concerned. There's examples of this all the time, but there's not many examples that I hear about. But the ones I hear about confirm this intuition that this is not something that's exclusive to either side of the spectrum. For example, there was a recent thing where some random Republican senator caught wind and said that people who get DMCA strikes should be charged with a felony. That's loud. Ignore that. Yeah, people who get DMCA strikes should be charged with a felony. I'm like, the fuck? That's insane. That's cancel culture right there. That's more direct cancellation of you will go to jail. But that's still unacceptable from a a value system that should value liberty, right? That's just unacceptable, and it's coming from a Republican. So, like I said, there's no reason to think that cancel culture is an exclusively left-wing thing. Anything more than that is just a matter of stats and how you count what cancellation is. I've also heard stats that it's actually that the left gets canceled the most, and I don't actually trust those stats simply because how are they counting what counts as cancellation? I think cancellation isn't necessarily something, happening. Cancellation doesn't have to be the kind of thing that happens when an institution of sufficient size cancels you, or it doesn't have to be that big. It could be small. It's more about the way in which you're canceled. It's more about how you're socially punished and for what reason when you step outside of what is conventionally affirmable or acceptable. So, what the fuck was my other point? Yeah, cancel culture is something that the left and right both seem to have the ability to do. And the reason, this is what I was going to get into, the reason is that cancel culture is actually something that's natural. It's something that, and we need to understand, to really understand this demon, you need to understand where it's coming from. What it comes from is not any value system. What it comes from, I think, is honestly just conventional human perception. It comes from the implicit belief that if someone says something you don't like, you don't care as much about what happens to them, right? You don't care about what punishment they face, and you think to punish them themselves. And this is something, I talk to left-wing and conservative people, and they all seem to have this intuition. When someone said something they dislike, and they're being canceled, they don't care. They're like, well, fuck that person, right? I've encountered this, in interactions with my conservative parents as well. It's not exclusive to the left here at all. This is just it seems to be something that's just part of natural human perception. I don't like what this person's saying. It's offensive. It's inappropriate based on my identity or my values. So they absolutely should be punished for saying it. How dare they? It's unacceptable. We should have a world where people don't say those kinds of things, right? Or we don't have to hear those kinds of things, and so on. That's the reaction. That's the reaction over and over again. That seems to be the most natural reaction. So which makes me think that reaction is what's really at fault. It's that reaction. It's that implicit association that when you are disconnected from a person, right? You're disconnected, in real life. You have no connection to a person who says something or does something that you find inappropriate. You just don't care what happens to them, and are perhaps even willing to say that they should be punished somehow. Because if that person, the association being if that person were right there in front of you, and if you were right there with that person, you would punish them, in the private context, right? You wouldn't let it stand. You wouldn't be like, if someone, calls you the N-word, you're not just going to be like, thanks, you're going to retaliate, right? Or if you're an immigrant and someone says some like fuck immigrants, you're not going to be like cool, right? You're going to retaliate, and that retaliatory impulse expanded over, take that same retaliatory impulse, but then separate the individuals. But it's just happening. It's just happening online. The person's still doing it. Okay, the retaliation is now through the online dimension, and because it's happening through online, and because the impulse is coming from many different people, the result is not a direct, in-your-face retaliation or whatever. The result is your private life is sabotaged because your private life is connected to the internet as well. The other person, the person who did the offensive thing. Because that retaliatory impulse is there within all these people, within all normal people. And that basically is the problem. The problem is that it's perception of goodness and badness at the private level that's just being generalized and applied across the board at the public level, because everything's interconnected through the internet. So you hear about things that you don't want to hear and don't want to be offended by, and you take them personally when they happen, even though they're not happening in your own private life. You just hear about them because that feeling of interconnectedness makes it feel like they're happening in your private life, which, triggers that retaliatory impulse, which then, is filtered through and is processed through a complex network of interactions online of all the people who have the same impulse and what they do, to then criticize or punish the person who did the thing worthy of retaliation, which then results in that person's private life being sabotaged, and the people around them feeling alienated from them, and the company that they work for firing them, and the platform, throwing them away and excising them, and so on. And then that's what happens. That's how it works. It's that retaliatory impulse that all conventional normies have. Well, actually, I would say I have it too. No, I'm not going to say that I'm special. Everyone has that retaliatory impulse, but it's just reinforced through online interactions that results in individual people's lives being sabotaged. The way to really understand it is imagine, for example, it's like we live in a society where everybody lives in a glass house, right? And everyone can hear what everyone else is saying. Okay, so like you're walking down a street and you can look into the glass house and you look into Bob's house and you can see all the shitty things Bob is saying about you and all the things that Bob is saying that offend your sensibilities and go against your values and your identity and whatnot. And you're exposed to it all the time. So you feel the need to say, well, it should stop. All of these glass houses need to either, guard themselves better and cease saying things that could get them socially punished, or they need to be punished. They need to be punished. They need to be thrown from their glass houses, and they need to be socially punished or be punished in some way for choosing to say that. But the issue is that they don't control the fact that they're in a glass house. Everyone's in that glass house. The glass houses are everywhere. Everyone has one. It's just a matter of time until someone decides to walk down your street and notice what you're doing in that glass house and how incorrect they find it, and enough to tell other people about it and be like, did you see Bob's glass house over there? What the fuck is he doing? That's messed up. That's wrong, dude. What's wrong with him? And then that's how it works. That's how it works. And the reaction to this is not one of recognition of that this dynamic is a problem. The reaction is one of self-preservation. The reaction people seem to have by far, like 90% of people I talk to when it comes to this is, well, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have done the thing that got you canceled, right? You should be more careful. In the age of the internet, you should be more careful. They interpret it from a practicalist, like pragmatic standpoint of what you do to protect yourself, rather than what is philosophically optimal in principle, which is what I'm trying to do here. Obviously, it's obvious from a perspective of self-preservation what you should be doing. That's irrelevant. The issue is systemic. Every person trying to be self-preserving is not going to result in the glass house thing being fixed. What it could result in, well, it will result in several things. First of all, cancellation is not going to stop, because you're not going to be able to silence all of the perceptionally bad behaviors that human beings have. Humans are not inherently good. Good in the sense of, like, they don't always do and say things that sound good and pleasant. They do things that sound and come across as bad and hurtful and harmful. So there's that. But also, as far as this instinct of self-preservation, what this does is this superficializes our culture, because what it means is we can't have any authentic interactions. Every single public interaction is now influenced by the collective impulses of people to hide the things that they would otherwise say, because they don't want to be, they don't want their glass house broken. They don't want to be interfered with. They don't want to be canceled. And this influences everyone's attitude, so it influences the overarching culture. And the overarching culture ends up being fake as fuck. There's no doubt that what's going to happen on Twitch now is like completely empty, fake, meaningless culture that no one will care about. It's inevitable, because you don't allow people to be negative, frankly. Now, in this case, I'm also talking about an extreme form of negativity, which is, bigoted negativity. But even that, believe it or not, there's many different gray zones for that are not harmful, and B, part of what makes things funny, part of what makes things interesting, part of what makes content compelling. Now, to go deeper into this glass house analogy, one of the things that we need to understand as well when it comes to cancel culture, there's a difference between public and private. There's a gap between public and private, and there's normally, when we think about something being a form of cancellation, we think of it as being canceled in public, right? And canceled in private. Being canceled in private is fair game. If I in private don't like what you're saying, I'm allowed to not talk to you. That's why I'm going back to that. It's the retaliatory impulse is private. Okay, but it manifests publicly because the internet has connected all of the glass houses together, so which makes everything public. The point of where cancel culture is a problem is within the public sphere, within the public space. That's where it should not be happening. That is the space that's sacred, that has to be maintained as openly as possible, right? In private, you can do whatever, but in public, you can't. And the thing with the internet is that it's expanded the public space. The internet has made the public space larger. Like I said, part of your private life is now exposed, right? That with the glass house, that means it's part of the public space, because, in that analogy, imagine basically all of the vision space of all of the things you could see from all of the glass houses. That's a public space, because everything there is visible to anyone walking on the street. It's not like a house that's, walled off so you can't see the inside. Everything that's visible is public, which means it has to be regulated like it's public. And the way to regulate it is to maintain that people can basically say whatever they want and not suffer consequences elsewhere in their private life. The public versus private thing is also interesting because there's so many conflated arguments about whether something is or isn't cancel culture that misconstrue the private versus public structure of it. Like when it comes to like the First Amendment, for example, think of free speech as an issue relating to the First Amendment, and that cancel culture would be someone breaking the First Amendment. But the First Amendment does not cover the nature of cancel culture or the nature of public spaces. The reason that the First Amendment only extends as far as government is because historically, I imagine the intuition they had. I actually don't know the specific reason, but that they came up with the First Amendment. But I imagine the intuition that they had to do with the fact that the only thing that's public is the government. And because the only thing that's public is the government, only the government can break free speech. Anything else that happens is private, and as private individuals, you can resolve it privately. If you don't like what someone says around you, you don't have to listen to it. You can block them. You can tell them to go away. You can not deal with them, and they don't have to deal with you. Problem solved, right? But the issue is the people don't understand how this works. What is public is not what is government. That's not actually true. Public is anything that is openly used or accessed by the public, right? That includes the government, okay, or parts of the government services, but that doesn't include everything. For example, I would argue that like large institutions or large businesses that everyone relies on are essentially public because everyone relies on them. Everyone goes to them, everyone uses them, even though they're privately owned. Well, by which I mean they're publicly traded. They're privately owned in the sense that they're not owned by everyone. They're not owned by the government. They're not operated by all of society. They're owned by just some handful of shareholders, but they're open to the public by their own model, and because of that, everyone uses. So Amazon is a public company in that sense because it operates in the public space. In this conception of public, Amazon is public. Walmart is public. Google is public. I mean, think about how could you not, like, public and private is not a technical distinction between, government market, or a technical distinction between privately owned companies versus publicly traded companies. It is a functional distinction between the way something works socially and the way it doesn't. Okay? A large business that's used by everyone is public, functionally speaking, because the public uses it. Whereas a small business is private because only some small number of people use it. It's literally just a difference of size. The bigger something is, the more public it is, likely. There's exceptions to that. Military, contracts and so on are not exactly public because most people don't use them. They're only used by the military and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the thing about cancellation. So the reason I bring this up is because one of the arguments against the cancel culture detractors, the free speech warriors and so on, is on the grounds that you're being censored by a private company or private institution. And this is why this conception of public versus private is incorrect. That's why I'm bringing this up. The actual difference between private and public in this conversation is the difference between functionally public and functionally private, not the difference between whatever is fiscally defined as public or private or whatever, market versus government. Public is whatever works for the public. It's part of the public space. By that logic, it is impossible to not think of the internet as a public space, and thus it is impossible to not view censorship on the grounds of private sensibilities or private values or private attitudes towards speech on the internet as not violating the ideal of free speech. It is impossible not to see it that way once you understand public to be what is functionally public. What is functionally public across the board. Now, there's still a conversation there about whether speech should be improved from a progressive perspective. Certainly there is. But to be honest, that's a whole nother topic that I probably am not even going to get into in this video. That's just a whole nother thing. I don't want to get into it. The point is, even if there's a way to do that, the way of doing that is currently wrong. The process is currently unjust. It's unjustified. It's unaccountable. And so that's why you have to concede that this free speech ideal has to operate across the entirety of what is considered the functionally public space, not just across the entirety of what is the government or us affiliated with the government. The interesting thing about the First Amendment, too, is like I imagine the reason the First Amendment doesn't extend beyond government as well is you can't enforce it beyond government. Again, I'm speculating here. Correct me if you know how, legal history or whatever, but I'm speculating that the problem with saying that extending free speech to be a principle that private institutions have to enforce, private in the strict legal sense, is that private institutions, if a private individual cancels someone, or a private institution or a private corporation cancels someone, the company and corporation gets to say that it acted, on the basis of its rights that it has. Okay, so each time someone gets canceled in the private sector, each side gets to say that they just acted from their own, liberties that they're allowed to act from, within our legal system. Which means that any time that there's a case of, the First Amendment being violated, it would be impossible to resolve because every side would claim the same defense, basically, right? I claim that my free speech is violated. They claim that their rights are being violated if they don't, cancel me. So it's just like you would have a quadrillion court cases that are would be just like functionally, operationally unfeasible to resolve. And I think that, again, the thing with law is that law is determined, basically designed around what it can do before what it should do. It's designed around what's operationally feasible. It's not operationally feasible to resolve every single speech dispute that can happen in the system, because there's just uncountably many. Most of those speech disputes can be resolved in the private sphere itself by private individuals acting of their own free will and taking the power and the responsibility to deal with whatever violation of speech that they dislike in whatever way they want privately. But if you take it to court, it becomes the court's business. It's just, you have to have a giant court case anytime someone said the N-word. it would be ridiculous, right? There's a concept that I want to introduce here as well. We're already 50 minutes in. This is a large topic. Another aspect to understanding cancel culture is to understand, besides the public-private thing and what's functionally a public space or what's functionally a private space, is to understand the nature of social capital, social economy. This is a concept that I've thought about a lot, that I definitely want to make more videos about and talk about and write about eventually. It's going to be very primitive as I explained it here, but the basic idea is that when you learn economics, you learn economics and the nature of commodities and values within the economy based on people's values for commodities, usually based on people's values for goods, services, and the like, and their preferences for these things. But our value system in general expands beyond just those things. Our value system also includes things like social interactions. It includes things like, social relationships and the quality of those relationships and what people say and how they act in those relationships. These things are not bought and sold, within the material economy. They're not bought and sold by businesses, but they are produced by people, and they are consumed by the people that interact with them. So they are still, I think, economic factors. They're just not economic factors that can be tracked using money. And that's the concept itself. That's what social capital is, or, you know, social commodities, basically. Basically, the economy that we know is actually just one half of the economy, or at least one subsection of it. That's the material economy, the economy of businesses, the economy of you know, institutions, of goods and services, of products, of buying and selling. But then there's the social economy, the economy of interactions and relationships and cultures, and the quality therein that we all participate in. You know, when you're meeting your friends and you're talking to your friends and you're memeing or whatever, you're making jokes, you're participating in the social economy. Each one of you is producing something that the others are consuming within that social interaction. And if they don't like what they consume, or they don't like the product or the output that you produce, they can punish you the same way you'd punish a business that produces something bad. But they punish you socially. They don't punish you fiscally, economically, right? So that's a social economy. That's not an intuitive concept, right? That's just basic. I understand. Like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. There's a social economy. We think of the social economy, but we have not really conceptualized the social economy very well. The social economy is it's a very, you know, complex creature, and we have not conceptualized it or theoreticized it or analyzed it anywhere near the level that we've analyzed the material economy. And even though there's errors here, there's still mistakes and misunderstandings about this. This is completely untamed, unexplored territory. There's understandings of it from perspectives of like psychology, sociology, anthropology, whatever. But a thorough understanding of the economics of it is not there, and how value is constructed and distributed and created by the social economy. That's something that, at least personally, I've just never seen. I've never seen a, you know, theoretical conceptualization of the social economy in terms of social value being produced by people and consumed by other people, as in the same manner that a, you know, you would produce a product or a commodity. Why am I introducing all this? The reason I'm introducing all this is because cancel culture, what's unique about cancel culture is that it does not operate in this sphere at all. It is not built upon it. Like, it has ramifications within the material economy for sure, but it does not give a shit about the material economy. It operates 100% within the social economy. Every single interaction that leads to someone being canceled, all of those retaliatory impulses, all of the back and forths, you know, all the perceptions of good and bad and the attitudes between people, all of that operates within the social economy. Okay? And because this thing has not been analyzed, all those interactions, as I've also argued before, are unaccountable. They're completely unaccountable. And as much as, you know, I still disagree with all, you know, the whole free market ideal, is that the interactions within the system lead to justified outcomes, but they don't lead to justified outcomes when the process that they don't lead to justified outcomes when the process that drives all the interactions is unaccountable. And this applies in the material economy, and it certainly applies in the social economy. The social economy is 100% unaccountable because no one's trying to account for it. And there's no way to account for it either. You can't really regulate the social economy like you can regulate the material one. You know, at least the material one, you can have a legal system that punishes people for not following the rules. You can try to authoritatively wield it. You cannot do this for the social economy anywhere near as much. Your only way of controlling the social economy is by basically driving it through popularity. The only way to influence it is by being a person or an individual or a group of people that are popular, that everybody likes, such that you can get away with whatever you're doing and whatever principles you're presenting. the thing about the social economy as well that's special about it is that the social economy can go around the physical economy and the material economy and whatever rules it has in it because of that, non-regulation thing I mentioned. Which means whatever, this is one of the things about cancel culture that's so pernicious, because whatever rule you come up with to try to go against it, they can find a way around it. It can find its way around. A great example of this is, rule of law even. Like, you can go as far as economics and say, well, okay, private companies don't have to platform people that people don't like. Okay. But it can go further than that. Okay. It can go beyond that. It can go... basically, the issue is that the social economy can influence all the other structures and institutions within society by influencing their culture. Okay? The institution of a internet platform or a company or a school or the government is not just the institution. It's not just the walls, the building, the rules, and the structure. It's also the culture of the people there. And if the people there have a certain culture and they think that something is culturally inappropriate because of that culture, that is the social economy maneuvering around the rules to get to its own intended goal. You see this in examples like where the arguments for cancellation and censorship have gone around the rule of law. Like, for example, the Count Dankula situation. The Count Dankula situation where he went to jail for making a joke. He argued in court in the Count Dankula situation that he argued in court that it was free speech, that he was just making a joke, it was free speech, and he still lost. He lost because the prosecution argued that it wasn't free speech. He was literally, he was literally talking about calling for the deaths of millions by making a pug do a Nazi salute. He wasn't making a joke. And I suppose people went along with this, or the jury went along, or whoever was there went along with this because of perception, once again, because of perception, and he failed. He lost the court case, right? And now he's like trying to do an appeal or whatever. That's an example right there, right? You would think the rule of law says free speech, right? You can't go to jail for making a joke, right? But you can, because all that it takes is people to believe that it's not a joke. That's all it takes. All the people on the jury, they just have to not believe that it's a joke, and now you're actually a criminal who's calling for the deaths of millions, and you have to go to jail. That's all that it takes. The social economy can literally change the definitions of things, because it could just say, regardless of what the situation is, it could just say, no, the reality is that this wasn't a joke, this was an act of harm, this was an act of violence or a threat to it. Thus, by some legal definition that already exists within the legal structure, the non-social thing, the things that are objective, there's a way around and to get the person punished. That's why the social economy is so unfortunate that it's poorly understood as an economy that has power, because it has the ability to go around any pre-existing legal doctrine or structure or economic system or principle. All that it has to do is just, perceive the scenario in question in such a way where it fits some definition of what the legal system says is wrong in order to get that person punished. Which means the legal system isn't even really a protection. The legal system doesn't really defend against cancel culture. It can't, because the legal system is only as good as how people interpret it. And if they interpret it by virtue of what the social economy tells them, that it's actually this, then the legal system is only, the legal system is not driving the outcome. It's the social economy that's driving the outcome. So that's the thing about this. This creature is very pernicious because it's unaccountable. And in a world like ours, where it's not driven by... In a world like ours, where the culture is so heavily influenced by the left, where left-wing sensibilities drive the interactions to such a degree. And, you know, how do I even explain this? The sense of structure that is needed to resolve these kinds of issues, to create fair outcomes for people, is not respected in the left-wing culture that's driving the social economy. Because on the left, much of the ideology is a reaction to the structure, the economic structure, the legal structure, right? It's actually, this model actually explains much of, you know, the history of the left and right here, because for the longest time, the left has not had a strong influence, has not had the ability to reshape or change the physical structure, the you know, the material economy very much. We still live in a capitalist economy. We still have the same legal system. We still have, you know, people like, you know, Republican senators and people like Mitch McConnell who, you know, won't even give a relief money during a pandemic and so on. We still have, the left has all these reasons to be disappointed with the material economy, okay? And because of that, the social economy is what they focused on. The social economy is what they've dominated, and now they actually do have just control over it, to the point where they have the ability to seep into the material economy and basically influence its decisions and its operations in a way that leads to unjust outcomes. And that's just saying this because it's not again, the left is not special there. The right could do the same thing in theory. It's not about the left or the right. It's just, I'm just saying that it seems, you know, it makes sense that the left is doing this because the left has basically has had no luck at addressing this thing head on, so it's addressing it through this kind of, you know, subvertive way, by just undermining it by working through social capital instead. So we don't live in capitalism then. We live in, you know, material capitalism plus social capitalism. And social capitalism is something that's basically owned by the left at this point. And that's not to say that again, this is also an analysis that's like not dependent directly on the goals of the left being right or wrong. It's an analysis that's dependent on the process being wrong and the outcomes that are happening being wrong by virtue of that process being wrong. Okay, you can't create a material economy that's fair and justified by ignoring a just process in order to challenge it. And you ignore a just process in order to challenge it, what actually ends up happening is we have injustice on both sides. We have an unjust social economy and an unjust material one. So yeah, that's basically it. I think that last part about the social economy is what really explains like how exactly it explains the playing field, basically, that all of this stuff is happening on. Because right now we don't know the playing field. And I think understand the playing field, the only way to really make things better is to attack both economies at the same time. Whatever issues that, you know, the left progressives have with the material economy and even the social economy, because parts of the social economy are dominated by the right. Whatever issues the left has with these things have to be addressed in the same way, right? Because in the same exact way, you know, simply trying to say that, you know, the left is censoring people does not mean that the right has the right to censor people, or that some alternative value system has the right to censor people, or has the ability to use, you know, rein the social economy to basically punish people in pursuit of its values. No ideology has the right to do that, because that's just an unjustified way of seeing ends. And the ends will never happen either, because the process that's seeking them is not rationally justified. And there's another thing here where I think there's some sort of connection between the process not being justified and the process not being rational. The reason the process is not justified is also because it's not rational. And because it's not rational, it's never actually going to fundamentally change what it wants to, because it's constantly changing what it wants, by virtue of that irrationality. If you pay attention to the left, currently, there is no consensus on the left as to what the goal is for society. In fact, the goal constantly changes. Prior to George Floyd, police reform was always part of the conversation, but then police reform became defund, became abolished. Like it progressed, because any time that there's a progressive idea that becomes popular, there's always some other extreme, group of radicals that have an even more extreme idea that say, no, we should go further. These people before us weren't radical enough. And they will keep doing that, because the only thing motivating it is the desire to change things in principle. The desire to be an activist and create change, because change is what's important. If the fundamental value form is change, the fundamental drive is to be against whatever other people have come up with, because to not be against it, to be an affirmation of something, is to not change it. So change is all that it takes. You've already seen examples of this with left-wing people attacking each other and trying to go after each other and tear each other down, because they're ultimately not all on the same side, right? Their own ideals differ. Eventually, someone on the left whose ideas aren't popular yet thinks, no, we need to go further than that guy. It's like, than someone else. It's like, okay, well, we have social democracy. Well, we need to go further. We need to go communism. Well, communism's not far enough. We need to have ultra communism, ultra mega super communism, whatever. You just need to, changing the police is not enough. Defunding is not enough. Just get rid of them. We need to get rid of them. Prison reform is not enough. Releasing nonviolent drug offenders is not enough. Let's just abolish prisons altogether. Like the point is, there's an incentive within the theory itself to just keep going further, right? To keep looking for ways to go further, because it makes you feel like you're having an impact and changing the world, and there's meaning in that for the people who are doing it. And because the process is unaccountable, this keeps happening. And each jump from, one idea to the next is not rational, because it's only motivated by that one value form and that simple linear consideration that more change is better no matter what. I'm talking about the left now. This is only because the left are the ones who are wielding the social economy currently in most spaces that are visible. The left are the ones that are having the mainstream impact. That's why I'm discussing them. But again, if this were the right, I'd be explaining how the right has its own, irrationality cycle that leads to cancellation. Again, you could imagine the same thing happening. Imagine like conservative religious Puritans, talking about like, well, you don't say the Lord's name in vain. You can't say the Lord's name in vain. You can't say bad things about Jesus Christ. And then they can take it a step further. Well, no. You have to go to like the strict definition of how we're supposed to understand Jesus and the Bible and all that thing. You got to go even further. You can't, you can't even joke about some, bad thing happening in, to Jesus or to some apostle. You get the idea. Like whatever sacred text defines their overall culture, there can be, more and more restrictive interpretations of it by successive activist groups, each one thinking that they're trying to purify the world even harder and make the world even better. And this cycle of irrationality, of us progressing in the direction of whatever each of these groups seems to want, is what creates the drive of the thrust of Jesus Christ, the thrust of cancel culture. And for whatever reason, the more radical groups are becoming more popular, more mainstreamified, such that their ideas are not dying out and just being relegated to some corner. They're actually becoming powerful. They're actually having an influence through that social economy. That's the thing that happened. That's the attitudinal shift I noticed. A lot of these things that like certain words are offensive and so on. This was always a thing. There was always, it always existed somewhere, these attitudes, but it feels like they exist everywhere now. Like Latinx is another example. right now, Latinx is the idea that you shouldn't call Latino people Latino or Latina. You should call them Latinx, because that way you include Latinos and Latinas or something like that. Now, you could look at that and think, again, that's silly. No one cares about that. But that's changing, is the point. Because the process is unaccountable, because each time there's a change, there's a new group that wants more change, that it's defined strictly in terms of some pigeonhole concept of change that they have in their heads that's wrong. They will pull, they'll pull everyone in that direction more and more, and it'll keep happening. And we've already noticed it. That's the change that I'm talking about. Like, again, you wouldn't have, back in 2015, you'd say they'd be pulling down, Thomas Jefferson statues. You'd be like, that's ridiculous. They're not going to pull down Thomas Jefferson. But then they started pulling down Thomas Jefferson. You'd be like, oh, they're not gonna censor this word. They're not going to censor this. But then they will. They'll find a way, because there's always going to be a new way to seek progress in their way. Right now, Martin Luther King is a big figure on the left. Eventually, this will get to a point where Martin Luther King will be canceled, because eventually it's never good enough. The problem is not the goal, it's the process, right? The process, without having a clear goal, right? Without having a clear goal, and the goal constantly shifting and being driven by impulses that are reductive, there's always going to be a new way to try to make progress happen by abandoning some pre-existing accepted thing. And this will keep, forcing society to change, and change in rather unhealthy ways. And like I said, this is no longer me talking about cancel culture. This is me talking about the kind of the ideological thrust of what's causing the tide to churn over and leave certain people struggling in the dirt. And it happens to be a left-wing thing that's doing it, but it could be a right-wing thing that was doing it as well. There's nothing special about whose value system is, there's nothing special about which value system is, reining the horses or driving the bus. It doesn't matter which value system it is. Some value system will do it. Any value system could do it, and it would be just as bad regardless of which one did it. And it would always happen through this social economy. If they were to doing it through the social economy, then it would have the appearance of, cancel culture as we understand it today. And the overall result is this thing escalates. Things become more reductive, more difficult. It becomes harder to make content. It becomes harder for people to not be punished. Mainstream culture becomes overly sanitized and inauthentic, as I mentioned, and you experience what we call social decline. That's how it's going to work. And it's at its strongest currently. I think this year has literally been the highest cancel culture has ever been at. And the only way... and I honestly don't know when it's going to stop or when it's going to get better. It doesn't seem obvious. It might be a kind of thing that just never ends as well. Like, who knows? We don't know, because we've never experienced it this, we've never gotten this far with the internet. So we don't know how it's going to look 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how society, will it still reflect these same, attitudes. And but it's not hopeless. There could be a way of resolving all of this. There could be a way of making it better and fixing the cancel culture problem. And in order to do that, I'm going to consult Jordan Peterson, who, made a brilliant observation when he said that, my rights are your responsibilities. To solve cancel culture, you need to understand, everyone needs to understand that equation, that one person's rights are another person's responsibilities. In order to really solve cancel culture, we need to have like a cultural awakening across the board where people understand just how much of the world disagrees with them, just how much disagreement is really out there, just how much offensiveness is really out there, you know, and to normalize that, to normalize acceptance of it, so that people understand that someone saying something you find offensive by virtue of you hearing about it on the internet is not reason enough for that person to be punished. You know, not at all. You know, we need to get to that level of understanding. And the way to understand that is to understand that it's your responsibility as an individual, it's your responsibility to uphold other people's rights. Thus, it's your responsibility to uphold other people's speech rights. So if they say things you don't like, things you hate, it's your responsibility to make sure they have the ability to say it, especially if it's things you hate. Especially. Because no one cares to uphold the things that you like. The things that you like are being affirmed naturally anyway within the social economy. Because if you like them, you're going to reward them. But in this case, you need to go out of your way to not punish the people who say the things that you hate. And this is what's so counterintuitive about it, because it goes completely against that retaliatory impulse I mentioned, right? The retaliatory impulse is to say, no, you say something I don't like, fuck you, I don't like you. But that's where private versus public comes in. That attitude makes sense in private. The retaliatory impulse makes sense in private. It does not make sense in public. Okay? If someone says something that triggers the retaliatory impulse in public, you need to have the opposite intuition and go out of your way to make sure that they have the right to say it. You need to go stronger and further out of your way to ensure that the right to say it is secured. Because if they say something bad, there's going to be a market force within the social economy that's trying to crush that person for saying something people think is bad. You need to sort of explicitly understand the kind of the nature of, you know, supply and demand, I guess, within the social economy, and regulate against it when someone's doing things that are overly, you know, hateful and negative to protect free speech. And it's very unintuitive. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of what you'd think. Currently, the intuitions is if someone says something you don't like, just block them and don't talk to them. You know, fucking leave them alone. Don't, you know, have them leave you alone. Force them to leave you alone. And if you're afraid of being canceled, just be careful about what you say. But those are the wrong intuitions. The actual correct intuition... My fucking throat is... The actual correct intuition is you have to go further out of your way to protect the rights of people who say things you hate. You have to... Them saying things you hate should be more reason for you to want their speech protected. Because if they say things you hate, they're likely saying things other people hate, which means there's likely some social capital that's being levied that's going to be... There's some social capitalist dynamic that's going to be working against them anyway. That's what we need to understand. And we need to understand this at all levels. Like, this needs to be, like people need to really get how this works, right? They need to really be inculcated in understanding the nature of social capitalism and the nature of cancellation and the nature of social responsibility in the glass house environment where everything is a public space and all the things you do online are implicitly part of that public space, and what your social responsibilities are in that public space. Your social responsibilities in that public space increase, but they don't increase in terms of what you say, in terms of harm. They have to, but they don't have to increase in terms of what you say in terms of harming other people or being hateful. They increase in terms of protecting the things people say that are bad and hateful. It's the opposite. It's the other one. It's the protection of the bad forms of behavior and speech. Again, at the public level. And you need to teach this shit to kids in school. Like, you need to have everyone understanding the my rights equals your responsibilities thing. Like, all the way down. And of course, there's other solutions that beyond just that one. That one's in terms of, like, overall, you need to change people's cultural understanding. You need to change culture. You need to change the social economy, which is to get people to understand the social economy, to challenge its effects. But beyond that, there's other specific things that we could do that other people have talked about, that I've heard about. One of the things is internet rights. Like a Bill of Rights for the internet, where all the speech that's on the internet is essentially protected speech, right? You cannot be used against you in other areas of private life. It cannot be used against you in for your job to fire you. It can't be used against you by a platform to get rid of you, etc. Unless you're tweeting from an official account or something, and you're the president of the United States, and you're the representative of a company and you're tweeting something, then it can. But otherwise, if you're just a private individual and you have your private account, right, where you're doing private things, anything you say there can't be used against you for your other private parts of your private life. There's that. The other thing you could do is nationalize and socially regulate internet companies, essentially make them public, and that would completely kill the argument that it's not the government doing it. If you nationalize the internet companies, if you made them, public utilities, that would then fall under the First Amendment. That's probably, something that would be helpful. And I don't know why conservatives are against this one too. I feel like, the intuition to be against big government is, again, counterintuitive here, because you actually would want the government to be bigger here, right? It has to be bigger because it has to pick up the pieces where, the market sucks and the market can't. And the market can't when it comes to the social economy because, as you can see, we know that it can't. And the third thing you do, and you'd probably need some combination of both of these, to be completely honest. You probably need internet rights for the private thing, and then also nationalize platforms on top of that for the First Amendment to cover them and stuff like that. Third thing you could do, which is very far-fetched, is create an actual internet court. Create some kind of court system or some kind of system of proceedings for resolving conflicts regarding speech on the internet. How we have like a civil court and we have a criminal court? This would be a third kind of court, an internet court, basically, covering interactions that happen strictly online. But that one might be far-fetched. And of course, there's too many interactions on the internet for the court to worry about it, for the court to process everything. So you would need some combination of the three. But ultimately, nothing is going to be good enough other than teaching people the nature of how these things work and getting them to take that social responsibility. Because even all of these solutions that have been listed aren't going to be enough by themselves, because, like I said, the social economy can just go around them. Whatever rule or regulation you create, the social economy can find a way around it. We already seen this with Jordan Peterson, actually, with his book. He doesn't need a platform. He's got a platform or whatever, regardless of his platform. Right? He has a contract with a publisher, right? But the people who work for the publisher say, like, we hate him, we don't like his work. He spreads hate and so on, and so his work shouldn't be published. And they can cancel him that way by interfering with the private agreement that he had with the publisher, which even makes sense because they're employees of that publisher, so they're attached to it. They have some stake in the company, right? That's the point. Like this thing never ends because it could go into anything. It can affect platforms. It can affect law. It can affect private contracts between businesses, between individuals and businesses. I mean, it can go further to the level of canceling people's credit cards and canceling their bank accounts. Why should, Bank of America have an account for, a white nationalist racist person, right? Like, it could just keep going and going and going forever to the point where you literally just say, fuck it, start throwing people in jail. But of course, if they ever get to that level, then they're outside the social economy. Then they're literally in the material, legal economy, doing what Nazis would do, forcing people in jail for their opinions and so on. And again, a lot of this stuff falls on the left in the flavor of the video, like I said, but I don't think it's inherently about the left. I don't think that the left is fundamentally evil in this way, that the right would be doing the same thing. Because it's not about left or right, it's about whatever sensibilities you have, whatever values you have, and how they're threatened by other people's speech. Okay? And how, and how other people's speech is interpreted as a harm within your value system. And that's not to say that it's not the case that speech is ever a harm. I agree, you shouldn't just call black people the N-word. But there's there's a huge gray zone, because at some point you have to introduce the fact that speech itself doesn't have to be the harm if it's only speech, you know, which means it doesn't have to be interpreted as a harm, which means it doesn't have to be punished as an act of harm, right? You have that intuition. You also have to think about the difference between targeted speech versus untargeted. You know, like the Kyle Kashev situation is another example of that. Screaming the N-word online a bunch of times is stupid, and you're not, you're an idiot for doing that, and you certainly lose respect points and so on, but you shouldn't be punished in a way where you lose, access to platforms, access to your school or whatever. That's ridiculous. The punishment should not be there, basically. Emma's saying this as well, because I could picture myself in the Kashev situation. I love screaming fucking offensive words. It's fun. It's funny to me, at least doing it in a ways untargetedly. But that's, again, there's no the conception of this thing does not account for the difference between targeted speech versus untargeted hate speech. Right? If hate speech is targeted, there's an argument there. Right? Although even there, I would still argue that, like, private interactions can resolve it. If someone's giving you hate speech, you have the ability to block them. You don't necessarily have a reason to take that person and punish them in a bigger way. But if it's untargeted should be complete free pass, as far as I'm concerned. And any fallout that happens socially within the social economy for a person who, says untargeted hateful things that are untargeted would have to be something that private individuals decide for themselves. But it cannot be this kind of thing where your access to the public space is denied and your interactions in the public space are heavily influenced by virtue of the private opinions of certain people and how they're influenced by it. That's the point. Yeah, that's basically it. What I had to say, and I can go further and further and talk about all the details I think that exist for hate speech and targeted versus untargeted hate speech, and where I think the line is when it comes to these social interactions, and obviously to what extent is a person who is harmed by certain forms of speech or who doesn't want to hear them, to what extent are they compelled to listen to them or to be exposed to them if the public space has to protect that kind of speech. There's a whole argument there, I think, for sure. It's not obvious where the line is on that side either, which is what the progressive people who are in favor of what I call cancel culture will defend, is that this is the whole argument with, like, the First Amendment, right? To what extent are the people that don't want to hear certain things in the right to not have to hear those things? To what extent are, people who don't want to hear slurs entitled to protection from those slurs? That type of thing. Yeah, there's an argument there, and there's ways of attacking that. There's ways of solving that problem, but the default has to be way over to this side, where we first guarantee speech across the board in terms of this counter to social perception and taking social responsibility to protect the speech of others, especially when they say things we hate. That's the thing. Thanks for watching. Happy New Year. Hopefully, on this topic, I'm sure, like, my paranoia for cancel culture has gone up, like, a lot, at least doubled this year, and it's probably going to keep increasing because we're at the height of it right now. Yeah, so I may or may not at some point be forced to take measures to survive. No, I may be forced to take measures to adapt my own content given the nature of cancel culture on the internet. Part of that could involve looking for other platforms and using them at some point, as YouTube makes it harder to create content, and obviously Twitch is you know, with the way that I use language, Twitch is almost certainly going to ban me at some point if I ever partner up. I might just never partner up, but stuff. There's you know, adjustments will have to be made while this thing is in full effect. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Happy New Year. Cheers. Bye-bye.